Hello and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by True Parley Grandmaster Foot. Hope you'll enjoy listening. This is a double feature one as well, so Mr. Foot and I have talked about these a little bit over time, and sometimes they've concluded that they just kind of can't get the topic down to fit in one Parley. I've provisionally agreed to allow this, but I will say in the future that I'm skeptical that this is ever really necessary. I think in this one you'll see why Mr. Foot wanted to do that, and we'll get into it more some other time. But in any case, this will be a longer Parley. It's about cruel video games. The bizarre world of cruel video games. Welcome back, folks. Mr. Foot begins. The first stop on our journey is another long one that deals with the world of truly cruel games. I'll spend the first paragraph of the chapter trying to explain what I mean by that, and then we'll look at a couple of interesting case studies. There'll be mild spoilers for the games Cruelty Squad, Underrail, and Fear and Hunger, but nothing I would be worried about if you still plan on playing any of these. Yeah, I agree. I think, if anything, you might actually be better off knowing the things that you're going to know in this parlay. And then we'll take a step back to try to find common patterns before attempting to answer a seemingly simple question: what the hell is going on here, and should we bother with it at all? These types of games. Let's define them. On achieving cruelty. 2 years ago, I made a parlay about the contradictory views on video game difficulty. I really liked that one. In that parlay, I attempted to understand the nature of game difficulty by splitting it into its four components of mechanical, strategic, knowledge-based, and numerical difficulty. And while that was a good parlay, there is a different way I could have approached the topic, and that's by splitting difficulty into challenge, punishment, and inconsistency, as follows. Challenge is the magnitude of the problem the game presents you with. Challenging games will pose problems that will take a high amount of mechanical, strategic, etc. skills to overcome. Punishment, the cost of failure. Punishing games will put pressure on you because of the cost of failure. The cost is usually time, but sometimes it's social or monetary pressure instead. This cost leads to psychological pressure, which acts as a multiplier for challenge. And then inconsistency. This is how much you can rely on the strategies you find. The easiest way of achieving consistency is randomness. Like in some runs, some strategies might not be available to you. But this can also include games switching up the rules or being frustrating due to bugs or broken mechanics. Super Meat Boy is an example of a game that is highly challenging, but neither punishing nor inconsistent. Hades is somewhat challenging and fairly consistent, but really punishing, as any death will force you to reset your run. Mona Lisa is neither challenging nor punishing, but inconsistent, to the point where some levels might be incompletable. Anyway. Something strange happens, though, when you turn up all three dials. You, the player, start to lose your footing, and the game starts feeling hostile, malicious, and most importantly, cruel. Nier Automata used continuous expectation resets to put you in a certain state of mind, and my thesis throughout this parlay will be that cruel games do something similar. They create a strange and powerful state of mind in the player that can be abused to create emotional peaks. You don't actually have to turn all three dials to max, you just have to turn all three up enough so that they greatly impact your experience. All games do this to some degree. Difficulty is often used as a pacing mechanism where you just have to spend a certain amount of time to overcome a challenge. While our three example games featured different degrees of progression mechanics, unlike normal games, the progression mechanics never lowered the challenge, punishment, and inconsistency enough for the game to stop feeling cruel. I've seen many people attempt to define truly cruel games throughout the years, but for the purpose of this parlay, this is the definition that I found helpful. With our upcoming examples, the cruelty is not used for pacing or surface level atmosphere, but for something else instead. And that other reason to create cruel levels of difficulty, this mindset they put you in, is what we want to explore throughout this parlay. Great intro section. So to review, we have some examples of games that Mr. Foot highlights for like combinations of these difficulty parameters. You may disagree with them specifically. They're just used as in examples to demonstrate the concept. And I'm going to give you some of my own, because I think that way of laying out difficulty is interesting, so we'll dig into it a little more. But that's our thesis for this parlay. Basically, you can turn up all of those difficulty dials, or a lot of them, and this is done for some simple reasons, like to make a game's pace different than it would otherwise be, to make something feel more challenging. To a point, if you just make it so it's difficult for the player to overcome, they kind of feel a sort of pushback. Like I've felt many times where I'm doing really well in a game and I have a powerful build, but I meet a boss where I die once and I had been cruising through the game, and so there's an inherent way in which your brain might go, oh, like that guy's sort of harder. And if you don't think about it too much, we'll get into that later, it kind of works and you feel like, okay, now I'm gonna focus up, and then when you win it feels kind of good in a way that it wouldn't have if there wasn't that pacing of, you know, you hit a little speed bump. We will get into that in this parlay, but we are going beyond those surface level things where obviously difficulty in its various forms has a lot of potential game design uses, and a lot of them are not to be cruel. They're not anything to do with being cruel to the player. A lot of them are just like, that's, it's fun. They're positive things. Many positive and neutral things. But to turn all three way up, I definitely think something that the industry is missing on the whole is why it is good. Why it is good for a game to be hard. A real problem in game design at the moment is, and for the past, you know, couple decades, for all of game design, I guess, is that people don't really don't beg the question about difficulty. When a game is hard, it's seen as that's good, and it's inherently good if you beat that game because you overcame something. But overcoming things isn't good. Overcoming things that are interesting to overcome is good. Your life being interesting is good. Some resistance can help make your life interesting, but a thing providing resistance doesn't then automatically lead to an interesting experience. And I think in many cases it like really doesn't. And a lot of the difficult games in current gaming are, in my opinion, extremely uninteresting or just not difficult if you a lot of the time it's build systems. You know, if you make an involved build, it's not that this game is an uninterestingly difficult game, it's that it's just not difficult, but only if you have an open-minded approach to the game's build system. Of course, that's subjective. I'm just telling you what my experience has been. I can name for you very few games that I thought were hard in a way that wasn't just stupid, basically. And that's my bias going into this parlay. It's going to come up a lot, so I'd be ready for that. I guess I'm a good person to answer this one to some extent. Anyway, but we're going to go a bit beyond that to ask, well, one of the things that it does when a game is like brutal is it changes your attitude toward it a little bit. It triggers your emotions in a way, possibly in a negative way. I think it's appropriate that I'm already feeling kind of pissed off about the general subject of this parlay. Not you're fine, Mr. Fruit. I'm just saying in game design in general. So that's what we're going to discuss. I wanted to briefly mention that a very similar question, but not the one that Mr. Food is asking here, as far as I can tell, is it fun to turn up all three dials? And I think the answer is more simply, usually no for most people. If you make a game very challenging, it, you know, has a lot of mechanical difficulty or strategic difficulty. It's very punishing, like you lose a lot of time if you fail, is basically what punishing boils down to in a lot of games. We're going to come down pretty hard on punishing in this parlay, but okay. It's those two things. And now imagine if that same game was very inconsistent. Now, that doesn't always mean random. It could mean things like you just don't all like the same strategy doesn't always work. The enemies don't always challenge the same things. You don't always get punished the same way. It's buggy could be one, but even if it's things that aren't randomness and aren't bugs, it's just like your tactics don't always work like that. It's challenging, it demands a lot of you, and it's punishing. If you don't meet the demand, then you lose a lot. But the thing it's demanding of you isn't consistent. Like that makes you feel cheated out of your time for a lot of people. On its surface, it doesn't sound fun. I bet a lot of you would agree. And so personally, I'm happy that we're not doing that in this parlay because I don't think it's a very interesting question. In fact, if I may jump ahead to the end of the parlay, which I've read and you folks haven't yet, Mr. Food, I think that one of our tasks here is to you're going to ask, like, what is the point of the games being cruel and eliciting that emotional peak? Another way to put it is, since it's so clearly potentially unfun at base, what is so worth, you know, the cruelty that it is then still worth playing these games, basically? They have a kind of big thing to pay off about them. Going back to Nier Automata, In some ways, this parlay is kind of a side quest off of the Invisible Wall parlay series as a whole. Nier Automata using this unique technique to kind of evoke an emotional response from the player. But these games are doing it in a different way, and a big problem with the way they're doing it is they're trying to get an emotional rise out of the player by doing something that is at baseline probably quite unpleasant for the player. I really didn't feel like anything was baseline unpleasant while I was playing Nier Automata. Not in a way outside of like normal video games, you know what I mean? It's not eliciting that emotional response in a way that is by doing something that is bad until proven good. It's like a basically nice video game, and then it also has this nice thing, you know what I mean? So you don't have to agree that the emotional response Nier Automata may elicit from a player is worthwhile, because it doesn't really sacrifice much to elicit that. But these games really, really do. And so there has to be something that means you, a person with standards, ought to play them to some gain. I guess is how I feel. I am going to go a little insane about that over the course of this parlay, and I know that because just writing the notes for the beginning 3 sections of this parlay, I got like actually angry and had to go get like a piece of chocolate and come back. So it's fine, Mr. Foot, you're not doing anything bad. I'm just saying I care about this topic. Like, I think it's interesting and very frustrating, and that games that do this are almost always literally just bad, and people are apologists for games that have these frustrating mechanics, and it's not moral, or it doesn't say anything good about you to overcome this type of difficulty. It's kind of just stupid. And yet, I absolutely agree, despite everything I just said, with Mr. Foot's thesis as well, that no, but it does do some stuff too. I just definitely don't yet agree that that's at all worth it, but I definitely agree that they're not doing it to be mean. The developers aren't being cruel. I didn't mean to say it that way, but okay. One thing that frustrates me a lot in game design in general is how players will often criticize something they don't like about a game in a really lazy, very thoughtless way, and just say, oh, the developers hate fun. It's like that. Stop doing that. Like, don't say that. You can just say you don't like what the developers like, but the developers are trying to make the game enjoyable in some way. It might not be for fun exactly, though I think 99% of the time it is. And so you can safely assume the developers want you to have fun and failed. They tried and they failed. It's not because they're mean, they're not bad people. It's not bad to like the thing they like. At least it wouldn't be reasonable to think that from their perspective. They simply failed to make that enjoyable for you, or you failed to get enjoyment out of that thing. And that's fine. It doesn't matter if you fail at something. That's okay. We're humans. We're pointless space dust. You can just fail. It's okay. It can just be bad. No one has done anything wrong to you by wasting your time. I'm very angry at this type of game design for usually being a colossal waste of my time, but I'm not angry at the developers because they didn't do anything wrong. They're trying to provide some benefit, and I think in many cases it boils down to my thesis for this parlay, which is that they simply haven't pushed that design far enough. They're kind of settling for a problem in game design currently and using the fact that it exists to elicit an emotional response. But these are all things that in the grand scheme of game design we ought to just solve. Like, they're just bad things that it would be better if we got past. And I would be more interested in seeing these games pursue cruelty with design that we don't already know is kind of just incomplete, basically. You'll see that especially in the second example here. I think we're ready. The goal of this little adventure we're going on is to explore the idea that turning up the volume on these difficulty metrics, all 3 of them, creates a kind of unique emotional experience, potentially. It can be used for other, more mundane reasons, but we're exploring the idea that it has some ability to elicit a further response from the player, and that may be worth sacrificing quite a lot of potential fun on the player's part, and time is definitely a thing we're going to get back to. While on the flip side, my thesis is going to be that many of these games spring from flawed design ideas, and it's just that you can channel that into something that like does have a really interesting emotional premise. but fundamentally either the players or the like game design as a whole is just temporarily at this moment in time not in a good place, and these games do something interesting with that, but that won't be interesting in the future. It will just be like that will have moved on, or it will be a flaw, and we'll have figured out something better. And I would be interested to see these games make the attempt to do their cruel emotional response eliciting thing once we are not just at a kind of false baseline with those game design ideas, once we're not just kind of stuck in that place temporarily, rather than just using the moment of the times to do something. I would be interested to see these games go beyond that a little bit and elicit a reaction without relying on that kind of incompleteness of game design. You'll see what I mean. Just quickly before we begin, I want to look at the 3 metrics for difficulty again. So just to think about them a little more. Challenge, so the magnitude of the problem the game presents you with. Challenging games will pose problems that take a high amount of mechanical, strategic, etc. skill to overcome. Punishment, the cost of failure. Punishing games will put pressure on you because of the cost of failure. This cost is usually time. It's almost always time, but sometimes it's social or monetary pressure instead. Psychological pressure, which acts as a multiplier for challenge. And inconsistency. This is how much you can rely on the strategies you find. The easiest way might be randomness. In some runs, certain strategies might not be available to you, but it could include games switching up the rules or being frustrating due to bugs or broken mechanics. For punishment, I really want to emphasize that the cost being time may translate into a player like me saying, right, but the punishment being time is stupid. I basically I'm going to overcome this challenge, and dumping time into it isn't anything. That doesn't make me feel better. That's not worthwhile. It's not interesting. If the way I overcome the challenge isn't just dumping time into it, I don't change up strategies, or it's hardly at all necessary to change up strategies. I will just be able to get through it with time. That is inherently just silly and a waste. But the key thing is that doesn't mean that the punishment isn't working exactly. It's just the punishment has turned into my anger at the subject. So I'm not going to reject this on premise. It's definitely a thing game design does. And I've played games that I felt this way about. I'm not saying I avoid all of these. How would I know I hate them so much otherwise? And so, and then for inconsistency, you make this point, Mr. Foot, but I really want to emphasize that, like, games switching up the rules aspect of inconsistency. It can mean randomness. It can mean bugs or broken mechanics. But again, a theme for me in this parlay is, does this topic of cruel video games even exist still if games are not just flawed in their game design? So in other words, if the game isn't just not functional, that would be inconsistent and will make the game harder, but that's because the game is not entirely complete. Or if that's intentional, I have some feelings about that. And if it's randomness, I mean, okay, but if the player just did know what was coming, the game is just hoping that the randomness will make things feel inconsistent. But what about the game consistently being inconsistent? That kind of interests me more. Punishment. People currently have kind of low standards for this stuff and will just throw their time at something because they think that it's morally good to have overcome a challenge that takes a lot of time. But it isn't. So what if players understood that? Would that piece of design still work? Yes, it would. It would still be frustrating. So I think it's important to note that while there are some concerns, I and I hope you have, about the nature of difficulty in the industry, this model still works even if we removed those problems. Like, even an existing player base that we don't have that had much higher standards for difficulty, this would all still work, potentially, anyway. So we'll see as we go through each game if it would, and what the game is trying to do by including these elements. Example 1, Cruelty Squad. Let's first return to one of my favorite games from recent memory, the delightfully bad, on purpose, Cruelty Squad. I won't recap everything I said in Chapter 4, but I'll talk about some aspects of the game I've neglected for time reasons. Cruelty Squad is ugly and bad on purpose. And it's also challenging, and levels can be fairly punishing, as there are no save points. But the inconsistency in the game does not really come from randomness. Instead, the game constantly switches up the rules of engagement. I knew you were going to make this point later, but that's why I wanted to emphasize it. The game goes from being a tactical stealth shooter to a speedrunning bunny hop speedrun game to some bizarre game maze you're forced to navigate. Once you beat that final maze and defeat the massive creature within, you will reach the ending of the game, an ending where you are happy, quote unquote. The final line of the game reads, "The sun smiles at you with eternal malice." That is about as strange as the rest of the game. So what's this game about plot-wise? In the story, the player is a member of the Cruelty Squad, a corporation that is tasked with the assassination of people of interest. This mostly includes CEOs, but also some crypto bros and a governor that suggested a progressive 1% tax on corporate profits. It's just that all of these assassinations are completely pointless because we live in a future where you can get a replacement body for $500. You don't enact change, you either slightly annoy rich guys or entertain them in a bizarre game of cat and mouse. Missions are tough, and you will need bioimplants to survive, but you have to pay for those yourself out of pocket. Similarly, when you die, you pay for the reconstruction of your body out of pocket, and missions pay very little money. You will be struggling to progress, while the inconsistent nature of the game will force you to adapt using tools you might not be able to afford. The game is cruel. By now you might be thinking, end-stage capitalism is bad. What an innovative premise. Did the game force cruelty on you just to make you understand the struggles associated with capitalism? Surprisingly, no. Everything we've talked about is just the first third of the game. From here on, the player may or may not give up on the limitations of life by eradicating hope, speculate on the open market using organs freshly harvested from civilians, and walk through a painting to rob a bank. Have I made some or all of these up on the spot, not to spoil the game, though that is left as homework to the listeners? At the end of the game, the player will try to rise above the cruelty our game world presents, and maybe even the cruelty of existence itself. Gameplay and presentation run parallel to the wider story. The game doesn't get prettier when you look at it for longer, but you begin to accept it. It's a game that doesn't find beauty in the hideousness as much as a way of living within it. Great first example. Even having not played this game, I thought this was a good first example, because the little I'm aware of this game is that, right, it's going to make you kind of challenge the idea of having these limits and struggling under capitalism, not just pointing it out over and over again, but no, I mean, it lets you overcome it just only by doing some bad stuff. It's going to give you tools to overcome those things, but it makes you aware of them. This is pretty interesting. I would say this one, without having played it, that aspect of the game strays close to just being like normal good game design. By having a variety of different situations for the player to overcome and letting you buy them with money, buy technology to overcome them with money, the player's put in a position where they notice that they would value if they had other tech available, and then, yeah, they're given ways to get it, and they're just not very morally good ways to get more money. This doesn't seem even cruel, really. It just means you're being, it's cruel in a basic moral way. You're being forced to, I don't know, kill people for their organs. That might be the one that's made up. I don't know, but that sounds like something that would be in the game. To make more money, to get enhancements to complete the missions, which you won't be able to complete without doing that because the game constantly changes the rules of engagement. Not randomly, just the game is reliably about, consistently inconsistent from before, changing the rules of engagement. So that you're going to want to have more money, and thus you're considering doing pretty cruel things. The player is under duress in a sense. You might not have wanted to kill a civilian for their organs normally, but the game puts you in a position where you see the utility of doing that, and they're not a real person. I mean, you should, in real life, I don't think that being forced to do this makes it okay to murder people and sell their organs on the open market if that wasn't eminently implied. But it's a video game, so fine. If they can get replacement bodies for $500, I don't know how I feel about that. Maybe you can steal but the organs, anyway, the economics of that are sort of breaking my brain, but let's just, whatever, it's fine. If it's as petty as pickpocketing someone, I kicked my desk out of anger, I guess it's maybe fine. Cool. So, yeah, I think that this first example is a great one to start for One, some of that sounds like kind of a little bit by the books game design when you look at it from this perspective. Now, the aesthetic of the game and the menus and your health total, like other elements of Cruelty Squad, are obviously not just by the books game design that is like actually just good and not trying to be cruel for the sake of it. I think that definitely is a thing the game does. I'm just pointing out that that's not that weird as a game design idea, don't you think? I don't know. And then the second thing, the conclusion, that the game isn't trying to make, the hideousness beautiful. It's just getting you to get used to it, and you kind of enter a state of mind when everything is just inconvenient and unsexy and everything is a whole mess. I don't know. For a counterexample, if you play as a heroic fantasy character in airbrushed Middle Earth, you don't imagine yourself harvesting organs from the orcs to sell in the open market to get the spell scrolls you need to spam disintegration ray on Sauron, or whatever. But that could be fun gameplay, but it kind of might not fit the fantasy for a lot of people, if that makes sense. And it's kind of similar to that thing that happens in a lot of RPGs where if the gear that gives you your stats that you equip has an appearance that you can't change, then you're going to end up wearing the gear that's good for your build, but makes you look ridiculous because it's terribly mismatched, which then kind of makes you feel weirdly underpowered. Or you're going to wear gear that looks good together, but then is then underpowered, which then makes it feel silly because you look like you should be a character in a fantasy epic, but you do no damage by comparison. Many a time I have tried to max min, not really min max, like the opposite, that phenomenon, so that I look kind of cool, but still do pretty good, damage or whatever. This is sort of ye old buildcraft experience for me. I think that phenomenon is kind of like this. It changes the player's behavior a little bit. If you change the appearance of the game, that's a thought experiment to do. If you made Cruelty Squad the exact same gameplay, the same geometry, the same, it looked and was like the same game, but it didn't look the same. It looked like Call of Duty. Would it be the same game? And the answer is no, I think quite clearly. Like there's something about the way that you frame it. There's something about you're not pickpocketing civilians, but then they die, you're harvesting their organs. If you reframed the game as you pickpocket them and then like they're effectively dead, but it doesn't look visually like you killed them, that would change the game. It would make the player feel different about what was happening in the game. It would make the player feel less like they were being forced into a situation, that they didn't want to, I would imagine. Again, I've only seen footage of this game, so give me a break here, but speculating, I think this is a great example in that respect. It uses the cruelness, even just of the environment and the interface, to affect the player in some way. And by being a game that gives you this uphill battle, it's using that difficulty as a way to just put you in a different frame of mind. It's trying to have structured mechanical difficulty, it sounds like. And by being a game that's just like ugly and janky, another thing I've often wondered is that maybe players who feel like parts of Cruelty Squad are unfair, because this is a really common complaint among people who struggle with boss battles in games. They say what I actually wish players would say more. They'll say, like, this boss is just bullshit, or whatever. It's interesting about that point. A lot of the time I feel like they're completely wrong, but that's a good thing to think. And it's really interesting as you go through games to just commit to saying, every time I die to a boss, I'm going to say it's bullshit. Just knee-jerk reaction, that's what I'm going to say. But is it though? I played Liza P, for example, and that was one of the examples I had in mind before where people think of it as a regularly challenging game, but I think it's just actually pretty easy, but it only appears not to be because people don't really think about open-ended approaches to the bosses when they play. They think of it as being Sekiro or Dark Souls, and if you play it that way, only that way, and you, as if by magic, are somehow not allowed to use any other tactics, I would argue that's fairly hard. I fought some bosses that way. That's hard if you play it like that, but there's absolutely no reason to do that. There's plenty of other like similar but just different tactics, or just very different tactics that led to my experience, where I, as a person who's not very good at these games, and I'm absolutely not trying to brag, I don't care about, I just spent the whole parlay shitting on bragging about stuff like that, so I don't care about this. I'm just saying this was my experience. Yeah, I often beat bosses on the first try, having never seen them before on whatever the highest difficulty offered was. And there was, however, also a boss right after I had beaten a boss without ever having seen their abilities before on the first try. So I didn't even adapt my build to like cheese them or anything. I just made a build that I thought would be good if a boss was really challenging, and then it was enough for me to beat that boss on the first try. And then right after that, the boss right after or right before, I don't remember. It's the boss in the swamp, the like deserty, swampy, junky area. If you've played Lies of P, there's this boss that you fight in this kind of junk heap arena, very simple boss arena that I think is just complete garbage. Like it's not well made. Every time you die, it's because the camera is rammed into the side of the geometry, not because you mistimed an attack, but because you can no longer see it. Not because you didn't step around a move, but because you can't, because the arena is too small. That boss is probably very easy by comparison if you just parry every attack, but you blatantly don't need to, shouldn't for any obvious reason, fight bosses that way for all the other bosses in the entire game, every single one. And I know that because I fought them all that way. So having there be one out of the, like 12 or 15 or whatever final bosses that is basically bullshit unless you fight them that way is bad. Like that is bad game design. It's not terrible, but it's bad. In a way, I think a lot of people would say, "Oh, I just need to get good." But my design logic is my argument. I don't matter. That's my design logic. But people don't tend to do this. Because my broader point though is I think Lies of P is a very beautifully made game in many ways. And so when I was thinking that, I had a hesitance to blame anyone other than myself, because I think that the developers have demonstrated competence in the game. Can you see where I'm going with this? What if the game just looked like ass all the time? Would you then be a little more willing to just say, "Oh, that's just it's buggy bullshit, too bad." And if you are set on playing the game, you simultaneously feel like, I'm going to play through this game, I'm trying to beat this game, and this is the game I've bought, I'm going to try to beat it and play it. And I think the developers are bad at what they're doing, even though that doesn't make any sense because they did it on purpose, and they obviously did it on purpose in Cruelty Squad. But people aren't me playing video games for a living, so you can imagine people thinking this, right? And so then does that make it easier to say, I'm not as frustrated? Because I could just blame the game. I've got a villain. This is a classic tactic in some forms of game design. You give the player a villain and they don't get as frustrated. So I wonder if maybe it's weird because it's like not cruel in a way, but it's interesting. It's an interesting response to turning up all those difficulty metrics and then making the game ugly. Maybe has this weird effect on the player. Very interesting. Maybe it makes it backwardly, indirectly easier to endure hardship, if that makes sense. Pretty cool. Anyway, very, very interesting first example. Let's move on to Under Rail. So far, we've somehow managed to barely mention Buildcraft in this series. I brought it up a little in the Nier Automata parlay, but yeah, I think it's very related to this subject, and yet it hasn't come up much. In my mind, Mr. Foot continues, there are roughly two kinds of games that are about Buildcraft, and of course a whole spectrum in between. First, there are games that are actively about making new and different builds. Most of your arcadey or like session-limited experiences, like once again Hades, fit into this mold. The second kind is about creating one build and then honing it until either perfection is achieved or the game ends. Most of your Buildcraft in RPGs fits into this mold, one classic example being your Diablo or Path of Exile character. All things being equal, and ignoring personal preference for active build making versus honing, there is a problem with that honing approach, accessibility or lack thereof. A phenomenon most competent build makers tend to run into is that games, while supporting smart, synergistic build choices for the honing style, are not balanced around them. While I love Cyberpunk 2077 very dearly, it's a clear example of this problem. The game is tough on lower levels, but once you get the semblance of a functional synergistic build, the challenge evaporates. Some games have higher difficulties to balance this out, but that rarely solves the problem in my experience. Do you accept this design flaw to keep the players who don't want to engage in the build system, or do you design the challenge of the game around the player having a well thought out build, thus making it inaccessible to the players that don't? Most games that focus on honing builds choose the former. They're balanced for you not making a synergistic build, and they're thus pretty if you do make any semblance of a synergistic build. But some brave idiots, like the developers of Underrail, a Serbian CRPG, chose the latter and made a game around you having a well thought out build. Oh boy. And the final product of Underrail stands out as a stunning piece of game design. I won't get into the weeds for time reasons, but the core design idea is that every trick the player has can also be used against them by various enemies. Nigh-on immunity to certain damage types, high burst damage grenades, all debuffs including stuns, consumables, forced critical hits, and even stealth, as well as counters to all of the above. The player is almost always alone, while enemies often appear in groups, which regularly pits the player at a disadvantage. It's a challenging game. This creates an atmosphere where everyone in the Underrail is fighting by the same rules. You are to survive at whatever cost necessary. If you are not capable of creating a build that can deal with all of these situations, you will be destroyed by this game to the point of soft-locking yourself 20 hours in. I myself needed 3 abandoned characters, or 5-ish hours of wasted gameplay, and some outside research before my current character was capable enough to experience the rest of the 60 to 120 hour game. Anecdotally, I've heard that other people take longer than 40 hours to reach that point, where they feel like they get stuck, I gather. And while we could argue about whether this cost is worth it for the average player, it succeeds in solving the fundamental issue of honing type buildcraft games for people like me, who are deranged enough to commit to mastering its systems. Death in Underrail doesn't have much of a cost because you can save any time outside of combat. Additionally, the game autosaves when you're changing the room, but mistakes you commit in the story and in your relations to the inhabitants of the Underrail, as well as in the build-making process, are punished to the point that it might permanently screw over your campaign, and you'll only realize your mistakes hours later. In this way, Underrail represents ultimate freedom and the responsibility that comes with it. Mr. Food includes a little note that to anyone who wants to learn more, feel free to message me if you want to learn about the build systems or you're interested in trying the game. There's no good build content on this game and I'd love to help. I assume Mr. Food means on Discord. True Parley Grandmaster Foot if you're looking for them. It's nice of you. The story sees you stumbling around the underground as you try to survive and understand what is going on at any given time. The contents of the story are not random, quite the opposite in fact. Everyone has their own motivations and reason to do the things they do. The impression of randomness usually comes from your lack of understanding. The setting, atmosphere, and general presentation underlines all of this. You will never quite shake the feeling that the caves and tunnels of the Underrail are a prison, one that is slowly driving all of its inhabitants insane, you included. Yes, this is the example that drove me slightly insane. Okay, so just to immediately dig into the very meaty contents of this one. First of all, I think it's the problem that almost every game that could be like what you're describing has had for me. I haven't touched this game at all, folks. So remember, I'm not saying it's like this. Is this section. So you said that this creates an atmosphere where everyone in the Underrail is fighting by the same rules and you have to survive by whatever means necessary. So if you're not capable of creating a build that can deal with all of these situations, you will be destroyed by the game to the point of soft-locking yourself. The problem that usually comes up for me is that the game doesn't allow you to learn what you need to know in an effective way. I'm not asking for the game to tell you you need a counter to high damage burst grenades, to tell you you need a counter to getting stunned. Enemies might be able to do forced crits because you can. None of that. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm saying is that a lot of games I've played where this would have been true, the mechanics were unbelievably opaque. Like you could never understand the mechanics without an involved walkthrough. So the game can't actually be played this way because you simply won't know why you're dying to a given thing. And to know why you're dying to a given thing, you have to do things that are so unrelated to playing the game that I would argue that is just cheap. That's not That's not interesting difficulty. That's just silly. It's a research project where were it an unexplained scientific phenomenon, and you a researcher trying to understand the laws of physics, that would be one thing. But it's a game that, if it's not meant to be fun, is meant to be like a stimulating challenge. But the game isn't actually designed for you to learn the things about it that you need to know. Sometimes I've heard people push back and say, no, you're meant to like brute force trial and error. That's why it's hard. But that's not hard, is it? Because you can just throw time at it and you will learn it very easily by just making a X and Y axis chart, and by process of elimination, systematically learning what all the effects do. It's not difficult at all. It's very, very easy to do that, but it's unbelievably time consuming. Like when we test stuff in Warframe, for example, this happens a lot. Somebody will mention a mechanic and we'll go into the testing room or into a mission to test it. It's never even remotely challenging to actually do the test, but it's just extremely tedious. It's very time consuming, but it's unbelievably straightforward to do the testing. It's the definition of easy. It couldn't be easier. It's immediately obvious from the start what you need to do to know the information, but it just takes a lot of time. That was kind of the bone I had to pick before about that is not challenge. Now, remember, I'm not talking about Underrail because I haven't played this game. It's entirely possible that this game makes those mechanics very clear. And so let me give you another parallel example. There's this game I've been playing around with called Duelists of Eden. This game is like a Mega Man PvP experience. So you play on this 4x4 grid and you can move around in real time. Attacks that you equip to your character fire at certain areas on the grid. So for example, you might have an attack that says fire on all 4 of the front column of your opponent's grid. So it'll hit those 4 tiles. So you move in real time, but there's just like on a grid. So attacks know where they can land. It's kind of like an advanced version of a hitboxes or hit detection. It's just very clear where attacks are going to hit as you're fighting. Something I really like. That's something that's always frustrated me about a lot of other fighting games. It's not clear enough where Marth's grab, okay? Marth's grab range is going to hit, is what I'm referring to, all right? I'm not trying to hide it. So it doesn't have that problem, which is nice. But the thing about this game is that when you start it up, you have a list of all the abilities you can equip to a character. And you know that your opponent is building out of those pieces. Those are the pieces. There they are. When you make a build, you just read all the abilities your opponent might have. And so when something happens to you, you get pushed backwards or stun locked into a corner. I mean, you might not immediately know what they did, but you can know instantly by just checking that list of abilities what they did. You see what I mean? And this is what I feel like is needed for an experience like the one you're describing in Underrail to be like an actual piece of game design, instead of just people will settle for needing to hash out or look up the details, but that sucks. Like, that's bad. I'm not willing to accept that. You can. And I might still really enjoy the game. I have enjoyed many games in spite of this problem. But that's bad design. It's not because it is fun or not. It's not because of whether you think it's challenging or not. It's because it doesn't suit the design goal. On the other hand, a game where you're encouraged to prepare for anything that could be a problem sounds amazing, to be a little positive for a second. This is something I do in kind of everything I play, and it is never, ever, ever necessary. I often pedantically argue, this would be good if ever there came a day where enemies did this to you, but then they just don't. That's the other thing about these types of designs. You have to have confidence in the developer to sort of see with you that they included this effect, and therefore that needs to mean that the thing that it's good against will come up, right? Will be enough of an issue, right? If enemies can, there are different damage types in the game, there has to be a point to them other than just flavor. At least that's how I feel. Otherwise, the player paying attention to them is kind of a scam, which over the time teaches the player, the attentive player, that their time, which they have standards for and which is precious. I know we don't actually live in a world full of players like that, but I'm imagining if we did, a player with proper standards would learn that it isn't worth their time to look for every little advantage because the game won't ask for them. But it sounds like this game demonstrates it pretty clearly. If you constantly see enemies doing these variety of challenging and punishing effects, and if the game clearly communicates what those effects do, that sounds awesome. It means that basically any build idea you can think of is another little tool on your, multi-tool Swiss Army knife that you can use to counter something that comes in. Very, very cool sounding. And indeed, I feel like in the long run, once the game design and the player base kind of settle to a point where the problems with this are fixed. Again, I've played lots of games that have the pieces for this, but the execution is very flawed, or lots of games where the execution was very flawed, but players said they really liked it. But I think that's because those players don't have very high standards at the moment. But once those things have resolved, a game at least like that, I'm sure will be extremely enjoyable. I think the weird thing about this one for me is it's like, so is it worth the cruelty? Well, it might be a unique experience for now, but if it doesn't meet those parameters that I was setting, maybe it's better to just wait. Like, a game that does meet those parameters is inevitable. And I think a thing that happens in game design a lot is that players feel like, well, the only game in town is this, literally the only game in town. And I want to play this activity. So I will settle for whatever imperfect state, that genre's at. But I don't think that that is a thing that is worth doing. There are infinite good games to play. Just play the genres that aren't woefully incomplete. Or, I mean, maybe they are complete, by the way. Again, I don't know. You're making it sound pretty cool. Maybe I'll try playing Under Rail. So yeah, the worth the time thing. I noticed that you put wasted in quotes. Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think what you're trying to evoke, if I might put words in your mouth, Mr. Foot, is that experimenting, if the experimenting is on a reasonable playing field, again, the game communicates its mechanics, could be very fun. Like that can be enjoyable. I don't mind at all if I feel like a character kind of runs into a hole, as long as I know why. And then I can really imagine having fun with a game where I do a playthrough and 20 hours in I realize eminently clearly, because the game has clearly communicated its mechanics, I didn't have to hash them out. I didn't fail because I just don't know what an effect does. The game tells me what I need to know why I've failed. I know it is knowable why I've failed, but I realize that my decisions have put me into a corner. And I go, I got to follow that build to its logical conclusion, and it doesn't work. Like, that's fine. I think that's fine. It reminds me of making a Magic the Gathering deck, thinking, oh, this concept might be cool, and then you hash it out and you make the deck, or you even played the deck, but oftentimes I've made the deck and I look at it and I go, this isn't good. Like, when you actually play it out, or not even play it out, but just look at everything put together, you go, but like it dies to removal. Yeah, everything in this deck dies to a stiff freeze. Like, it's amazing if there was good protection for my commander or whatever, but there isn't. This strategy doesn't elegantly fit in protection for my commander, or I die to literally any graveyard hate. Anyone doing anything to my graveyard makes this deck a pile of cardboard instead of a magnificent tapestry Rube Goldberg machine. And so you scrap it and move on. I am not upset when that happens. Like, that's fun. Like, that sounds fun. I worry, as I always do when I bring up this complaining about this topic, but if you're going to make this long-ass parlay, I definitely get to complain about bad difficulty in video games. I always worry when I complain about that people will see me as like, oh, but I'm just lazy. Like, I do just need to get good. You know what I mean? I would imagine that those people need to see how, I guess, like, tireless of a player I am, but I just reject being tireless for things I think are pointless. I spend a tremendous amount of time doing trial and error for things that are not pointless by my judgment, but just not for things where I feel like the challenge is something silly or rote, or you just have to dump time into it. Maybe seeing that effort, then people would go, oh, no, it isn't a get good thing at all. Like, you're perfectly willing to put the time in. You just don't think this is a good place to put the time in. I would hope people would see that. And to me, this sounds like a case where it could be really fun. Maybe one of the few examples we could have constructed where you could go 20 hours into the playthrough and then have the build or the playthrough not work out. And you might go, cool, like that was still a pretty interesting experience. And now I kind of want to try again in some way, especially if there's a lot of variety, which you've made it sound like there is. You're kind of convincing me. Maybe I should play this game. That sounds neat. So yeah, I guess my overall thoughts are that if this is a game that wants you to imagine the utility in a given option and then just assume you'll need that utility, that sounds awesome. But I have very rarely seen a game that I feel like did that well. And there's also some weird little corner case examples, like Limbus Company, where they do tell you all the stuff. I think Limbus Company makes an admirable attempt to make the mechanics clear, but because they can be kind of labyrinthine and they don't really display them much for you, you do often have to do a lot of digging and puzzling to figure out the actually pretty simple takeaway you need to know. And that can be fun, sort of follow the logic through, but sometimes I understand people who might otherwise have enjoyed that call and response. It just feels tedious to literally read through, basically. I can kind of get down with that. I think that is somewhat of like a factor of there just being a lot of text and the attacks being abstracted. You know, if you're playing a game like this where, you know, when you have to respond to a high burst damage stun grenade, you see the enemy throw a grenade, is what I'm imagining. I haven't played this game, but what I'm imagining is you see an enemy throw a grenade, and then you go, oh no, that's a big radius. I've been playing this game a little bit, and I know this game is full of hot bullshit, so that could one-shot me in a large area. Like I guess I need to look out for that kind of stuff now. And then you run away and realize that hiding behind cover just around the corner probably isn't that safe, or something like that, you know. Because it's more kinesthetic or intuitive or visual rather than a ton of text, I think people have a lot less trouble engaging with such a thing. I wouldn't be surprised if this ends up being relatively accessible compared to something like Limbus Company, where it's objectively probably more clear. And yet, because it's all text, I find it's kind of like math equations. People's eyes immediately glaze over. Like, I understand, but I'm not sure that that's really a problem with the way that those games do it. I can just imagine that if a game visually shows you, people might be more comfortable. Yeah, I don't know. I also wanted to mention this idea that I mentioned earlier. We got into it a little already about this thing, like a lot of games are doing something with cruel game design, but it's only because the genre is kind of incomplete. As you say, Mr. Food, there's a problem with that honing approach to build making versus like honing one build, which is the accessibility. Games have a real issue with difficulty when they offer build options. If the player just has a better idea, that either is the game's difficulty or runs away with the game's difficulty. And thus, most games have really bad balancing like that. In fact, I personally think that the games that allow you to make your own builds like this, it can in a way be some of the worst designed games in terms of build systems, because they don't have any solution to that. You know, I've very rarely seen games put up any of a fight or make any attempt to kind of do something about the player behaving that way. I can think of a lot of things that the player could do to you know, fiddle with that. You can mod the game, you can turn up difficulty options. It's often not enough. Usually your build is many times stronger than the enemies, and so the difficulty options have the very same problem. If the player hasn't made an involved build but is just better at shooters, the difficulty options need to be lower enough in increased difficulty that they'll be suitable for a player who's just more skilled and doesn't have a better build, and thus useless to a player that does have a better build. If the player does have a better build, they're so much more powerful than a player that doesn't in most games that the difficulty options need to make enemies literally unkillable to people that don't have a better build, thus making them useless to players that don't have a more involved build. But you can mod the game to have higher difficulty. Sometimes the game's difficulty options are open-ended enough that you can get something going. But there are solutions to these problems. Like in game design, there are just broader, like better ways to do this. In the future, in the next few decades, probably. I don't think we're that far away from this. This won't be an issue that games have nearly as often. This is an incomplete moment in human thinking about game design, and eventually people will just figure it out, and then we will have a solution for this. Just one tiny example of what you could do would be something like the player primarily gets magic items in their D&D role-playing game from heists, from stealing them from magic item auction houses. Thus, whenever they get more powerful by getting a piece of gear, they gain more enemies and more powerful enemies because the auction house knows what they stole. Not only sends appropriately powerful goons after them, but the goons know what the magic item is and can thus kind of counterplay a little bit. Pretty interesting. It's almost like I've done that in my own D&D campaign. As a self-balancing thing, where the player gets rewarded with more content if they steal the thing, and they get their powerful thing, but at the same time, the game has a reasonable response that doesn't feel unfair in exchange. And the player feels like, well, the side quest I'm going on to get more powerful to defeat the big bad evil enemy is like that I steal this magic item and get stronger, with the minor setback that I need to defeat the mafia goons that are coming after me in exchange. Like, that's okay. Like that's fine. And that's only a simple example, but just to prove to you that there are very kind of simple ways that you can make this not a problem for games. Another way to look at it is that as game design improves and humanity gets more used to playing these kinds of games, humans will just be better at game design, and thus games that have a baseline higher difficulty become tenable. You don't have to make games accessible for the player that doesn't make a build forever. Eventually, humankind's tendency to make builds will rise high enough that a normal person can engage with difficulty designed for people who kind of do make builds. And there are other solutions, but without getting into it too much here. Wizards of the Coast, why do you keep making these games that are like not reliably fun unless you make them an onslaught of evil, but then if you do, they're really, really good? Like D&D and Magic were the examples I pulled from. Anyway, let's keep going. Example 3, Fear and Hunger. I've thought long and hard about how to describe this game. The answer I arrived at is that I can't say anything that hasn't been said before. If you want to learn what kind of game Fear and Hunger is and how its mechanics work, you should check out one of the many great videos on it. In his video, Super Eyepatch Wolf created a summary of the gameplay loop that conveys most of what I would have said in a relatively short amount of time. The video is called The Cruelest Video Game. Mr. Fruit says the first 5 to 10 minutes give you a solid enough idea. Yep, I'd agree. I watched the first 7, perhaps, minutes. Alternatively, you could play the game yourself. Just be warned, the game contains many moments of physical and sexual assault. Just be careful if that stuff easily upsets you. But I highly recommend experiencing the game for yourself if you can, purely based on its uniqueness. We'll get back to that. Throughout the many games I've played in my life, I've never experienced anything quite like Fear and Hunger or its sequel. And I believe the reason for this is that Fear and Hunger is the purest distillation of this cruelty that we've been talking about. There's a note on sexual violence in Fear and Hunger, but I think it's sufficient to gloss over it by saying that the creator questions the inclusion of it, and that we can all agree that a lot of the time there's just no point to sexual violence in visual media, but that you feel like there is some reason for its inclusion here, and the creator seems to be being thoughtful about whether that is a thing that is good to do. That actually probably took longer than reading here, but just proceed with caution if you decide to play this game. That's all we're trying to say. Cool. The turn-based nature of the combat perfectly lends itself to horror. Once combat initiates, you are hit with a metaphorical page turn as the game reveals your enemy. The player usually moves first. This builds anticipation as you try to figure out what this enemy may do and how you will react. This can be agonizing because every limb of a given enemy acts independently, and you have to decide which of them to prioritize with your limited actions. Early enemies like the guards start off easy with 3 limbs, 1 mutated arm, 1 holding a meat cleaver, and their stinger. But as you descend the dungeon, the game begins to build on this basic idea with the goal of overwhelming you. You encounter body snatchers with their forearms, the bizarre uterus enemy and its, for lack of a better word, spawn, or the terrifying harvestman. Alien creatures with 5 asymmetric limbs that, contrary to all enemies before them, don't attack. Instead, they just stand there caressing you. It's almost like the logic of the combat slowly deteriorates with the later enemies, while the challenge and punishment associated with a failed run keep rising. If I had to describe what our examples feel like metaphorically, I'd say that Underrail is an underground ravine. You cannot escape to the top, you cannot see the bottom, and the walls are slowly closing in. And Fear and Hunger is an abyss, one that occupies some dark corner of your mind, slowly drawing you in, asking you to descend despite your better judgment. The key to understanding the magnitude of Fear and Hunger's cruelty is its apathy. The game doesn't care about you, and no amount of time investment will change that. It will always feel random and unfair. Like Undertale, you can talk to every enemy you encounter. Most won't listen. Those that do might do so just to abuse you further. All of this created the only moment in any game where I prayed to an in-game deity. Prayed to an in-game deity literally. Not to use some explicit game system, but in the hopes that they might save me in this bleak situation I was stuck in. It was one of the very few games which made me feel truly hopeless, that made me question if I could beat the game. I vividly remember 2 moments of cosmic horror where I thought I had figured out the scope of the world, only for it to reset my expectations and make me feel like a weak ant being crushed by forces beyond my control. All this and what came after are the emotional peaks that only truly cruel games can create. Wow, easy for me to say. Right, I think this is the one where I can't avoid my frustration with the idea of game design like this by saying like, but it's kind of just good normal game design, or, well, but if the player is willing to just like trust in the game and the game earns that trust, you could just think about its mechanics in a way that it could be fun, maybe, but that's sort of not what we're here for in a way. The only thing is to engage with this feeling like the game just is cruel. I think the first thing I want to cover is this idea that if you've thought about game design a lot, the psychology inherent in making a game's game design fun for players, for humans, should immediately raise a few alarm bells when you hear, the game doesn't care about you. If it genuinely doesn't care about you, it's not going to be good no matter what. It's not going to be fun. It's not going to be anything. It's not going to create a pronounced artistic vision in the person, or so I would say. I find it useful to think of there being kind of broadly 2 approaches to art. The first being you display what is in your head in a very complete way, and other people enter it, experience it in some way. And the second being that you think about what the player will think and act as a sort of benign deity guiding them through the experience while having made decisions maybe they wouldn't, make the game a little harder, a little harsher in these moments to up the tension, drama, fun, potentially, but then that ends up making the player have more fun. You've been thinking about the player when you did those things, in other words. Game design is a field of art, if you think of it as abstractly art in this sense, where the player has to operate the game. So I have argued in the past, and will continue to, I'm increasingly convinced that this approach, where you just make a tableau of a thing you think and then the player can kind of experience it, a book, a painting, a video game, basically just doesn't work for video games, because to have the player have a given experience, despite the fact that you have to require them to do something themselves, you have to ask them to operate the experience in some way. Well, you have to think about them, is kind of how it appears to me anyway. Again, that doesn't mean you coddle them. It doesn't mean you think about them and do nice things for them necessarily. Like a good storyteller, you kill your darlings and maybe put difficult challenges in front of them and stuff, but you're doing it thinking about what their experience of them will be, because that's the person there. The player kind of makes the art out of the game that you've put in front of them. So the immediate concern and I bet a lot of people who think about game design would have, is that if the game literally doesn't think about the players playing it and doesn't care about them, if it always feels random and unfair, it depends a lot what you mean by that. Later in this parlay, Mr. Food is going to ask, am I just being gaslighted? Definitely, maybe by that line, I would say. Like, there's an element where it's like, that sounds like it's just bad game design. But without further context, we can't really know, of course. I haven't played this game, so I don't know. But there's reason to doubt. If you were someone who was interested in this parlay and you were thinking about these games and you wanted to engage with this topic yourself, a thing I wonder how many people do, but there's people who do that, right? You probably don't want to play this one, I think, because there's a real question about whether this is a good thing to do in a video game. Whereas the other ones, it's like, yeah, but that at least easily could be in the name of good game design. We just don't know for sure if it is. Whereas this, it's like, without us coming up with a way that that could be anything other than bad, it's just bad. It's just failing at one of the basics of game design. Now, I'm going to assume for the rest of this parlay that it doesn't. Why? So why do they do that? Why do they make the player feel like that? First, we're going to speculate why maybe the game appears not to care about the player, appears to always be random and unfair. It will always feel random and unfair, but why it's just not, basically. So, and the first one is related to what we talked about in Underrail. It sounds like this limb thing is communicating things pretty well to the player. Let's go off just what Mr. Foot wrote in the parlay. Early enemies like the guards start off easy with 3 limbs, 1 mutated arm, 1 holding a meat cleaver, and their stinger. You descend and encounter body snatchers with 4 arms, and alien creatures with 5 asymmetric limbs that, contrary to all enemies before them, don't attack. Instead, they just stand there caressing you. It sounded weird, random, unpredictable, like you would die to some random bullshit. But strictly looking at the things that you've told me, I mean, the game sets up the idea that different limbs have different attacks. Imagine that you had a stun grenade that made 1 limb not act. Well, you enter a fight, and there's this moment of horror. You go first. There are 3 limbs. You see one of them holding a meat cleaver. One of them is a stinger. One of them is this creepy mutated arm. There's a fear the game is evoking in you. Which one of those things do you not want to happen to you? Throw your grenade wisely, but that's not really unfair or random as per se. That sounds like it communicates its design very well. And then in the future, when you see enemies with lots of arms, well, okay, well, the arms are going to attack individually, so I have to pick which one to focus fire to disable that ability. Then comes a mix-up. Uh-oh, sometimes the game breaks the rule. But how does it break it? You said that these creatures don't attack you. Unless there's some trick where that actually does just kill you. I mean, that plays up a lot of drama. You've learned to be scared of this feeling, and it's elicited this emotional response in you, and yet the game doesn't respond to that by killing you in a way that, if you were thinking about the game design, would just kill you for some cheap reason. Right? Instead, it's something that's creepy. The alien just caresses you menacingly, and so you feel afraid. But in terms of gameplay, has a design law really been violated here? Not that laws aren't there to be broken, but just to say, is this anything other than normally communicating your game's mechanics, and then they have an interesting mix-up planned for some emotional impact, but it doesn't really break that kind of social contract of you will be able to do things that are good and they will be good with some reliability? Because if the game isn't like that, if the game doesn't provide that feeling like you can do things that you would, the game has communicated will be good or effective, but then they're just not always, then to some extent it doesn't really feel like you're playing the game. You can imagine a theoretical game with a bunch of different dialogue checks for weird little rooms in Fear and Hunger. You go into a little room and there's no enemy in here. There's just some creepy encounter. I can imagine the game being like this. It kind of looked like there's going to be stuff like this in the game when I watched the big excerpt of that video. So let's just imagine. Some rooms there's an enemy, and the limbs are different attacks reliably, and when they're not, it doesn't make the player instantly die, basically. So there are mix-ups, the player's nervous of what the limbs will do, but it doesn't just make the player die if they do something that would have made sense in every other situation. But sometimes you go into rooms where there's nothing. Let's just imagine this happens. And there's a creepy chair or a doll that's weirdly animated to life and talks to you. And let's imagine that there's dialogue options, and that one of the dialogue options kills you, immediately outright kills you in every room. And another dialogue option gives you some small reward, not at all equal to just killing you. And then a third dialogue option is kind of safe. And more obvious. How about that? So you can risk it. You can try to figure out the dialogue and get a little boost. What if you're doing well in a run, but you're having trouble? You want to get that little boost from the positive reward, but the negative reward is much bigger. Now let's imagine that the dialogue options were essentially random. that the outcome of each dialogue is not like role playing. You try to figure out what the doll is feeling, and then if you respond to, the doll's queries to get him a new nose or whatever, and you get him a new nose, then he kills you, and that wasn't telegraphed in any way. Or some other similar sentiment, but this one, actually you get the reward if you give them the nose. They're random, let's imagine. I would argue that it's not that that's bad. It's not that it's not fun, though I don't think it would be fun, and I do think it would be bad. I would argue it's just not really a game, if that makes sense. I guess that's where there's a concern here for me. I'm not sure that you can make a game that truly is random and unfair, that is really random and unfair, that is actually a game that can be played. I mean, it's tricky because when you play dice or war, that game where you have a deck of cards and you flip over the card and they flip over a card and whoever's card is a higher number wins. Everybody thinks of these as games, but from a useful definition of game design, are they though? I don't think so. I don't really think so. And indeed, in dice or poker, let's say, the game isn't so much what you roll on your dice, and is more like the betting. And even then in dice, it's a little arguable whether that's actually a game. Is pulling the lever on a slot machine a game? People colloquially call it a game, but we are in a context where a more specific definition would be useful. So, I mean, is it really a game? Do you play it as per se? You don't, in my opinion. Not really, anyway. It's basically just gambling. It's not really a game. Whereas poker, you could argue, well, you have some input, and a lot of the input is just bets, but that part is a game. The bluffing is most of the game, you would argue. The randomness might make it less game-like, the true randomness where you can't rely on anything, but then the betting is a thing that you do have control over, and there are pretty clear tactics. Not perfectly reliable, but that's fine. That's not the concern. So if the options are really random, then there's an argument that that's straying into, it's not a matter of it being fun or good or bad game design. It's arguably just not game design. It's kind of trying to do something else. And that's fine. We're nitpicky specific game definition over. Back to normal colloquial game definition. A lot of people colloquially call visual novels games. And I would personally agree that that is a useful thing to colloquially include as being a game. If a game is a visual novel, it's basically an interactive book. You click through the book, you have some dialogue option choices, but they often have a minimal or even no impact on the story. But they can feel game-like in their interactivity. I think it is useful colloquially to just say those are more games than not for a lot of people. And that's fine. Being more specific, they're very ungame-like, I guess is what I would argue, but it doesn't matter for this conversation. So looking at Fear and Hunger again, I don't want to get too distracted by but is it even a game at all? Let alone, interesting game design. I just want to point out that perhaps we've left the realm of it having a relationship with difficulty, and it's more like if you read a book that has this level of chaos to it, and the outcome of the text of that book, essentially outside of your control because it's completely random, then affects how you're doing in a roguelike over here that is separate from a mechanical perspective. What effect does that have on the gameplay? And the effect is you're scared of what will happen in the story. It has some effect, right? So kind of interesting. If that's the situation you have, I'm speculating a lot, of course, but if that was the situation you had, is that really doing a game design? But that's an interesting technique. I could see something like that being used to accomplish a lot of things in game design as a whole. I would stress that I'm not entirely sure I agree that anything bad has to happen to the player for all of this to work, though. For example, let's remake this simulated version of the game, limited simulated version of the game that I've created for this example, in the following way. We're going to remove all of the negative outcomes for the player. You can lose a fight, but we're not going to have it be that a limb that is unmarked in every way will do a way worse attack to you, at least not objectively. When the alien with 5 asymmetric limbs scares you because you think, oh no, 5 attacks, but then it just caresses you. You don't get a punishment. When you go into a room and there's dialogue options with the doll to get their nose, there is no fail state. You might fail to get a positive reward, but we don't give the player a negative reward. They don't just die. Let's imagine a version of the game like this now. I don't think that the tension has been removed. It's just less a waste of the player's time. This is what I always say when I get into difficulty discussions, so I'm a little worried. I want to have a new opinion about this, if there is one to be had. But I don't really think like that would reduce the tension. Let's make an example situation more specifically. You have stun grenades, but you have a limited number of them. You go first. So every time you enter a fight, you going first is really key there. You want to stun a limb that looks scary. Now, what if the punishment is not that you die instantly if you stun a limb that didn't look threatening, but that if you don't stun a limb that looked threatening, sometimes it doesn't hit you for a lot of damage. You don't get one-shotted, but sometimes it just wasn't dangerous. You fight the thing with the cleaver, the stinger, and the weird appendage, and you stun the cleaver limb. You were scared of the stinger, and so it's between the cleaver and the stinger. The weird woogly hand that didn't look as threatening is indeed not threatening. The stinger does hurt you, but in a following fight you lack the grenades to stun the cleaver, and you're scared of what the cleaver will do. It's the unknown after all. But then the cleaver hits you and it doesn't do as much damage as you envisioned. It's weaker than the stinger. This doesn't make it not tense. Now in the future you go, a lot of the time the limbs do as much damage as I thought they would. So I would rather preemptively stun everything that I see. And when I don't have stun grenades, I'm scared, even full well knowing that a lot of the time I won't get hurt. It's still like, oh, I wish I had them. And when you go into a room and give the doll its nose or not, or whatever random, dialogue options you have, there's no negative thing. But if you don't get the positive thing, like another stun grenade, you go, oh shit, like, I hope the next limb doesn't do a lot of damage. You're not going to get one-shotted if it does, but you still feel a tension. There's consequences to it. I am going to approach the hill that I have at times died on, that the punishment aspect of difficulty is kind of pointless, like sort of doesn't do anything in a way, and that you can often create whatever tension you could have created by essentially just toning it down a little bit. After all, in a virtual sense, if you don't get the stun grenade, that might mean you lose the run. It might be the same as, like, the doll just kills you. Against the next enemy, you needed a stun grenade, so if you didn't get the positive dialogue option, you more or less do get the negative one. But it doesn't force you to lose the rest of your tactics right there if you don't get it. It doesn't say you just lose and we remove all control, basically. There are kind of two branches from here. For the rest of the parlay, we can consider my updated thesis. Do you actually need the punishment angle in that design? But then also, the second part, or is that punishment exactly the point? Is it that having there be something where you just die after, a bad dialogue option, even though that's kind of the same as if you had just gotten nothing but you didn't get the reward, but it just feels worse? Is it that makes things sort of more upsetting? But I hope you'll agree that it's at least interesting to consider how their tension remains. The same tension is kind of there if there's no like extra fail state added. You might just argue the tension has been increased if you just die. Now, I'll argue that for a lot of people, well, the tension will be increased all right, enough that they will understand that the game is just going to waste their time and they would just want to leave, when in fact you would get the same, but just less of an intense emotional experience if they just removed that punishment. And I'm not sure how to feel about someone who insists that it's not meaningful unless you have that heightened time wasting, basically. But that is kind of what we're here to do, so let's find out. Obviously, as it's a double feature, I'm going to go like get a drink of water first. But just as a little interlude, I wanted to clarify that when I say things like, oh, but I think that's just a waste of time, or people have too high standards on this type of design and it's actually bad, I mean, I will never stop questioning whether I think that that is a good idea, ever. Like, until I die, perhaps even after that. I know when people say these things in general, it can be frustrating to hear because it feels like the person has just decided they would rather just think of it this way, and therefore the topic is done. It's over, right? I would hope, but shouldn't assume, that, as someone who makes Parley, obviously I don't think that way, or it wouldn't be interesting to ask me these things. The only interesting thing about this is that I'm open to changing my mind about that subject. I'm just noting, when I say what I said before, that this is an area of philosophical thought about fun and just experience, like challenge and game design, that I have been to before. I am familiar getting to this point, so I'll just keeping a sharp eye out for, okay, so from here though, hmm, where are we gonna go? Not Mr. Food and I've read the rest of the parlay, so I know that already. But with all of you, I'm just trying to telegraph this idea that I think it's worth being wary at that point. People do settle and do miss out on a lot of fun by settling that way. I just want to give one quick example of that before we continue. For me, the classic one is multiplayer games. It's really common to hear people say, like, I just play this because it's fun with friends. And it's like, okay, but things are just fun with your friends. So why don't you play a game that is better? And then, you'd be having like more fun and your friends would be there. Anyway, and so if those people, were more demanding about what game that was and thought about what game design they'd like and played games with their friends, they would have more fun. And there would be no real drawback to doing this. It would take maybe one evening of chatting on Discord, and then they would permanently have more fun forever every time they spent their free time together. And I know that because that's what I did. A couple of years ago, we kind of just played whatever we settled on. Specifically, around the time my partner and I started this relationship, she got way into Apex Legends. And when we were not living together, we played a lot of Apex Legends in a trio with another of my friends and then another of my friends, one of those two trios. A lot. That was how we stayed connected, and a lot of how we got to know each other as adults after kind of disconnecting toward the end of college. And that was an interesting experience, but Apex Legends itself isn't a very good, battle royales are not a very good, like, time to experience investment. It's very likely that you will spend a huge amount of time looting and then just die to some circumstances. You can play around that, you can. You do often have to have a pretty similar experience. You remove a lot of variety if you do that, in my experience. But without taking down the whole genre, I think there are solutions to that. Just like I was saying with the whole honing linear build system thing in Underrail, it's just an incomplete genre. Like, we'll find out solutions. It doesn't mean Battle Royale as an entire idea is somehow moot just because it can spend a lot of your time to have this like that. No. And it doesn't take that much time. I mean, you could just try one and have the experience sometimes if you want to go on the roller coaster ride. Yeah, absolutely. I'm just saying there certainly is something questionable if you're going to spend like a lot of time doing that as your nightly driver, if you will. And if you're a person who plays Battle Royale games, I hope I'm not making you feel bad or ridiculing you, but I would politely but firmly suggest that it's probably worth exploring playing a game that isn't like that in the evenings, where you respawn really, really quick, and where if you have 2 hours and things go badly, you might essentially not play for the entire night. Like, having a game where that's just not possible is better, I think, is basically just always better for a given play group of people. But people get comfortable playing what they're playing, and they're worried that they can't bring people along if they, have the hurdle of learning in front of them. I understand this. It's outside the scope of the parlay, but I will just say, I think it's worth a try. Like, try suggesting, what if we just had a few games and we just pick which one to play instead? If it's that people want to play the same game over and over again because you unlock stuff in the game and that makes you better off over time, well, maybe it isn't worth having to feel like you need to progress in that game if it holds back variety you would otherwise benefit from. Anyway, just an example of what I mean when I say, like, this or that genre problem. It's not a death sentence. I don't know. And I'm actually being very hopeful and open-minded by saying that. That's my intent anyway. I'm saying, I'm just thinking out loud about things don't just get a pass because that's how it is. They could be better. Things could be better. They don't have to be this way. They could just be some better way. And likewise, what feels like cruel game design is possibly a mirage created by incomplete game design, where you actually could have all the benefits, but not a lot of those detriments. We just don't know that yet. And it's worth asking. That's what we're doing in this parlay. Anyway, we continue to an analysis chunk. Patterns in cruelty. At first sight, we deal with a first-person shooter, an isometric CRPG, and a dark fantasy JRPG, our 3 example games. These have nothing in common except this element of cruelty as far as gameplay. That's where you would be wrong, because the parallels are crushing. Let's start with this. All 3 of our examples take the preconceived ideas of what games in those genres are like and use them to screw you over. This was a point I made earlier about being propped up by how people currently think about things. The cruelty is on top of the crushing sense of helplessness you experience when attempting to figure out how these games expect you to engage with them. One might think that the appeal of cruel games is overcoming unfair mechanics and impossible odds. And while this is a part of it, all 3 of these are not that fun for a large part of their runtime. If one fundamental assumption of all games is that games should be fun, then all of them break this rule of game design. Furthermore, the existence of a game implies it can be beaten, and because all these games are in some way obsessed with this concept of cruelty, and with the suffering that cruelty causes upon the player, you'd be forgiven if you thought that these games are about enduring suffering and negativity. But that is also false. In the final ending of Cruelty Squad, the player character finds peace by transcending their worldly existence, by letting go of the negativity. The entirety of Underrail takes place underground. The setting is an inescapable, crushing prison, but by the end of the game, you come to learn that even in that prison, there is humanity and alternatives to violence. And by the end of Fear and Hunger, the game acknowledges that hunger and fear are forces powerful enough to drive humanity toward a better future, a future we see in the sequel. And there's a note here that I do think we need to include, a note on positivity in cruel games. These are among the many things I took away from these games. Perhaps this shows my bias. You might come to different conclusions. I could offer evidence that supports these interpretations, but I won't, because that would entail another 2 pages of parlay. While it's fun to discuss different interpretations, I'd prefer not to get stuck in that discussion. But I do think that Mr. Foot's biases going into this are very important. Like, they will have shaped this parlay, and it's not Mr. Foot's fault. We can't know them as easily as we can know them from me, because Mr. Foot doesn't get to respond as they go while I'm reading the parlay. Whereas mine, I can say something that sounds biased, and this is my job. My job is to notice when I say stuff like that. And often when I say it on streams, you all can point it out. I don't think I do that often, but at times I've been told, quote, "Then I think you have a stick up your ass if you think that." And I responded, "Right, I did have a stick up my ass about that, but then," I was continuing the story, "right, that is why I kept thinking about the subject." So that's not at all to Mr. Foot's discredit, but just to note that this is their perspective alone on these games, and that it's reasonable to say that might not be how other people see it, sure. But it's interesting to note that these games are challenging assumptions from games. And that was kind of the point I was trying to make at the top of the parlay, that I think a lot of these games are arguably just not cruel. Not that cruelty is arguably good somehow, but that they're just not cruel. And that, in fact, it has a lot to do with the fact that players think they know what to expect from, X, Y, or Z genre, when in fact they kind of don't anyway, and these games just lean into that, in my experience anyway. Another example would be people who are sick of a game being remade over and over again, but if you just haven't played one of them before, that's not really a critique about, like, the game. It's interesting to watch videos critiquing games that are like a remade formula of something. Far Cry comes to mind, where, I've watched some videos that are critique a review of, like, Far Cry 6, for example. I really enjoyed Far Cry 3. It's been a while. And I haven't played any of the other ones because I hardly ever play anything that is released to the general gaming market. And I watched those videos, and I noted as I watched through them how many of these are criticisms because you had to play for a job. Far Cry's, all of them up through 6, because you played Far Cry 4, Far Cry 5. Almost all of the reviews mentioned the previous games, and I would say about 2/3 of the things they brought up were things that are problems because people have played the other ones. Not really game design issues. Now, don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean there aren't game design issues. I don't know, having not played them. And many of the reviews did point out things that, like, that just is bad, like, that just doesn't look fun, you know? Here's a boss fight. Here's trivializing the boss fight. Did that look like a good boss fight? No. So that's a game design issue, you know, sure, potentially. But without context, you know, those problems might be different and some of them would disappear. And I think this is true of the cruel games as well. Depending on your expectations for video games, they might seem cruel, they might seem to defy that. But a lot of the points that you listed in this section, Mr. Food, are interestingly like kind of avoidable. Like they might just not happen for some types of players. They really only exist temporarily because of the current state of the industry or the players that might commonly play the games. And I wonder how many of the players that played these comparatively niche games, Cruelty Squad was reasonably popular, actually had that experience, because they might be players who play a wider variety of games. Or maybe it's even less common to play a wide variety of games than I think it is. And I've done that, but very few people have. Maybe. I don't think that's true, but that it's possible. I don't know. Yeah, just that it is a trend among them that they rely significantly, it sounds like, on what the player would think they knew about games and about genres. And you could just not think you knew those things about games and genres. And you will think you don't know those things about games and genres. As humanity progresses its knowledge of game design, people will stop being as confident that that just means this. People will have more experience and have played games that, you know, didn't follow that pattern, and the patterns will be less followed. I think indie games are a really interesting case study about this, where they both are the exact same game over and over again sometimes, but also it's a trend where there's been a lot more unique design per game in some ways, but not something we have room for here. Just that would be an interesting thing to peruse. I'm arguing on a large scale that gaming is more particular. Each individual game nowadays is less similar as a whole to other similar games, whereas previously you'd pick a genre and the games in the genre would be often literally identical to each other. And so that's not true anymore, and I'm arguing it will become even less true as time goes on. So this idea that a game will kind of upchuck your expectations, that effect will weaken as time goes on, probably indefinitely. Mr. Fruit continues, all three games are among the most blatantly philosophical games I've ever played in my life. NPCs in Cruelty Squad frequently reference philosophical concepts in regards to the limits of the human form. One of the endings quotes a text by French philosopher Georges Bataille. In Underrail, you can have an optional 40-minute-long conversation with an old ferryman about the nature of existence, ethics, and the purpose of life. And Fear and Hunger features the Pocket Cat, among other things. They're a character that philosophizes about the light and dark forces that drive the world, as well as the nature of authorship, something that we covered in detail during Part 5, the nature of intentions in art. What is happening here? Why do these games, which many people write off as joke games at the player's expense, feature all this unmasked direct philosophical discourse? In fact, the most I've personally seen since playing Nier Automata. All three games have also extended their tendrils into my real life, like very few games do. They colored my day-to-day existence like some strange version of the Tetris effect. The Tetris effect, a phenomenon where test subjects reported seeing falling blocks hours after playing Tetris. Remarkably, this was also reported by test subjects who lack the ability to form long-term memories, meaning they don't remember ever playing the game. I didn't know that part. That's somewhat, wow, interesting. So it really creates patterns of thought, is your point there. After playing Cruelty Squad, my brain began tainting my day-to-day life in a, for lack of a better word, inhuman way, one that mirrors the mindset you have to get into during the later stages of that game. While playing Underrail, I went on a walk and I inexplicably felt like I was still underground. And while playing Fear and Hunger, I felt like a part of me was still trapped in the dungeon, unable to leave until I had completed what I came for. This same sensation that every character feels in regard to the dungeon in the text of the game. Pause here. Yes, here I think is where I did a little switcheroony on you. When I suggested in the Fear and Hunger section that maybe you don't need the punishment for the player, and it would be like, it would just be maybe you could argue less scary. It wouldn't be less scary for me, I predict, because I would just think it was stupid if I felt like wasted my time by just killing me immediately. But it might be more tense if you made the player instantly die after certain choices. That would be startling. This is where you can begin to see how there could be an argument that you kind of do need to do that to have this effect. Do you need that strength of shocking the player to get the thoughts into their hippocampus or whatever so that they have experiences like this? You might. I don't know. You might. There's a tension in Tetris as the blocks build up that creates a drama, a stress, a modest stress that causes different brain chemistry than other effects do. And I don't mean to be disingenuous about that when I suggested otherwise during the Fear and Hunger section. I mean, we don't know. I'm open to a peer-reviewed study. Maybe some people feel like they do know, but I don't know. But the big thing is that it's possible that you actually, it turns out you do need to do that to have this effect. But then the further question is, okay, but I can see it being interesting, challenging, fun in a way, to be worried about each hand attacking me and wanting to stun one preemptively, even though I know it might not really hurt me, but there's a tension there. I can see that being having benefits, having a point to it. And then if you made there be this big negative fail state, this big punishment and loss of time, you might gain this effect where it kind of affects your everyday life thinking, but you would lose some of the other value of the game as a thing in itself. And so it's still a matter of weighing like that thing, like looking at the world differently. I'm going to say something probably a little bit surprising to some of the regular audience, which is that I value the thing Mr. Food is describing here very highly, but that's actually why I don't personally feel like it is worth it on that grounds. It's not that hard, in my opinion, to experience a kind of perspective shift like this without it being that the game design has to be essentially sacrificed. Every other benefit of the game has to be sacrificed, but then it's extreme enough that you feel this everyday life feeling. I don't think that's a good trade. I think there are ways to get this type of feeling, just not from video games, that or from other kinds of video games, Nier Automata maybe, that doesn't require as much of a negative. Like that's a very inefficient way to get that feeling, is my opinion. But I'm not arguing against its value. It's just that I think it's fairly readily available, and we could do a parlay about that. But an interesting point. Again, I won't excessively pass judgment. I just wanted to throw it out there that if some of you are thinking, okay, but that sounds bad, Mr. Food, why do you want to experience that? I'm actually on your side about that one, for what it's worth, Mr. Food, but I still don't think that that makes it good that those games do that. Because I feel like there are other ways you can accomplish it. And I feel like the cost is pretty high, is I guess how I see it. Let's bring it on home. All three games question the purpose of what you're even doing in the first place. The world of Cruelty Squad features a video game called Gorbino's Quest, a metaphor for the game of Cruelty Squad. Many players exclaim their inexplicable obsession with what they call an objectively bad game. The final stage of the game is called Trauma Loop and plays exactly like its name suggests. Underrail has NPCs questioning player behavior. Why would you go explore if everything wants to kill you and there's nothing to find? Why are you carrying around trash that no one is going to buy? Sure, you kill to survive, but does that make the act any better? Obviously, the answer to all of these is like, the player is saying because it's a video game, but it's like, And finally, Fear and Hunger features one of my personal favorite moments in any video game. You come across a chair in a small broom closet next to a stairwell and decide to sit down for a bit. This is the monologue that follows. The chair is surprisingly comfy. You relax here for a brief minute. This is what it must feel like sitting on a throne. The idea lingers in your mind that you came to these dungeons on your own free will. No one forced you to come here. You could have just slept late on that morning you embarked on this macabre quest of yours. There are countless things that you could be enjoying at this very moment, but instead, you sit in this chair, surrounded by the cold, piercing darkness. Sitting here knowing that the moment you get up, death might be waiting for you just around the corner. It's horrible, to say the least. This moment itself might be my best summary of the entire parlay topic. Really interesting. I think this is going to be very useful for our conclusion, which we're going to go to right now. Questions about correlation and causation. What the hell is going on here? Let's get the easy stuff out of the way. Without putting you through the abyss, the peak wouldn't seem as large. Maybe it's once again about contrast. And while many games try to depict uncomfortable topics, there's only so much you can do without making the player actually suffer. Cruelty is something akin to the most extreme experiential approach you could take to evolve emotional peaks. Sometimes these games feel pointless, stupid, and unnecessary. They seem to say that to you. I've once heard it said that nonsense is the antidote to a world where nothing makes sense. For some godforsaken reason, these games make more sense to me than most of the other stuff I play. They make me feel things where most other games leave me feeling nothing. When I broke out of my post-automata depression in the previous parlay by playing games that were novel to me, this is not where I expected to end up. At the end of the day, these games make me look like a damn hypocrite because they're all these design decisions which I would have despised in any other game that I somehow find acceptable here. I genuinely couldn't find a good argument why that is. With this, we arrive at a huge issue. Sadly, many players bounce off of Nier Automata's continuous expectation resets. They find it strange or quirky, and they don't open up enough to experience that state of mind or its varied and interesting advantages. It's even worse with cruel games. Many players don't understand why you would inflict these games upon yourself. Honestly, I cannot blame them. These games are not fun in the same way any other game is fun. I, True Parley Grandmaster Foot, the one and only GOAT of Parley, did not have fun while playing these games moment to moment. I feel a different thing you could call fun. That enjoyment is based on how unique and interesting they were. Sadly, my experience tells me that this is a me thing, and few are able to empathize. This opens the path to another question. Is this the only way to create these emotional peaks? Maybe this is just primitive and unnecessary. I feel reminded of the many ways to create a meaningful choice, something we discussed in episode 9 of this series. Back then I said that there are lots of complex ethics and difficulties in execution when you cause emotional distress in players, but isn't this cruelty thing just that exact same emotional distress? Is there an alternative to cruelty? I don't know. Maybe there is something other than this brute force method that would make you feel those things, and if there is, I've yet to find it. If we flip the question to, is cruelty a consistent method to create these emotional peaks? Then once again, I don't know, but probably not. Here we have 3 games that succeed, but I'm sure you can think of at least 3 other cruel games that fail to achieve anything with this same approach. For me, Noita, Darkest Dungeon, and Other Side are 3 cruel games that did nothing for me despite their cruelty. Parlay's a Q&A format, so here are some provocative questions. What the hell is going on here? Again, I want to get your outside perspective on this. Am I gaslighting myself? Is this some sunk cost fallacy? Why do I feel like these games are allowed to break rules of game design I would despise in any other game? Have they turned me into an elitist? Are cool games the new path for venturing outside the invisible wall that we've been looking for? Or have I lost the plot somewhere along the way? Are we perhaps closing in on the realm of the black wall, the place where maybe this art shouldn't have been created? I gave away the plot earlier, I realize. I shouldn't have said this is like a side quest, but that's what I think, to just give the answer away quickly. I think this is a very worthwhile, but not long-term productive little excursion that could be very worth going on. I certainly will be. I'm definitely going to play at least one of these things and give it a shot, probably under rail, and just to learn, to follow along. To have the thing like fun, but that is not quite fun, that I would just call like stimulating the brain. I have this thing that I feel like in life it's more valuable to live in a way where you have the most experiences. If they're negative, but they're not negative enough that you have to have less experiences to have them, you should have them. Is basically what that mindset says. If you have to go through something painful, but it's not painful enough that you have to have less experiences, it's better to have the experience rather than to not have the experience. A hard day of work, if it allows you to still function the next day, like fully function, don't overwork yourself. I probably most people don't need to hear this advice. Maybe I shouldn't have used this example. But anyway, you know, do it. Like, that's good. And it's the same thing here. If you're going to have a game that's going to be unpleasant, but you were going to play something for 20 hours anyway, maybe it's better for it to be one of these, you could argue. But it's entirely possible for many players that they would enjoy these little enough that they would get to have less experiences, that they would be sad, depressed, frustrated, literally angry at people. And thus, there is real potential harm here, though nothing I'm very worried about from a moral perspective. I'm just saying that from a value in your life perspective, negative experience is potentially good, yes. Underestimating how negative a thing can affect the rest of your life, bad. You know, it might actually not be worth having these experiences, even if you find them interesting, if they take enough of a toll on you. But evidently they didn't for Mr. Foot, so I think it makes perfect sense. Sure. The reason for good game design is to move the genre forward in an efficient way, not to make every game have perfect game design, certainly. So I don't think that's bad. You know, I said a lot of that earlier in the parlay. But you're looking for advice. This is probably one of the most direct times you've asked me what I think. So let's just break it down a little bit. First of all, yeah, there are a lot of reasons to doubt what you think about these games. I agree with you about that. Let's just look at them briefly. So first of all, you have a clear, it seems like you have a need for them somehow. That thing about like they make sense to you in ways that most other things don't. That feels like it's filling a need, but whenever something is filling a need like that, something else could always be filling the need. And it's usually better for it to be something that's not harmful. But these don't seem to be that harmful, so I guess it's fine. You know, an example for me would be where people get, you know, self-fulfillment from something like bullying people or I don't know, like drinking a lot of alcohol in one sitting or having spicy food or something like that. You can get your fulfillment as a human being or just accept that you aren't worth anything as a human being from any number of places, which is why it's bad to get it from those places. A thing I think is always a disconnect for these people is it's like you having a need isn't bad. We're not ridiculing that. It's just that you won't accept that you could get the need filled elsewhere. And what Mr. Food is doing here is being open-minded about like maybe this isn't necessary, which is the only problem with people behaving that way. Like you just don't need to do this. They think they do. You know, people are being mean to other people because they think they need to. Not because they're magically a bad person, but because from their frame of reference, they don't see that they obviously don't need to do that to get what they perceive as their need met. Their need is real from their perspective. That's all there is in their world. So you can't just say, well, you don't need to make yourself feel better than other people. It's like they do from their perspective. So the problem is that you just don't need to do that to make yourself feel better. And in this case, I would say, yeah, like I do things to achieve the what you're describing as the benefit of these games a lot, but never this, I guess, is the place where I'm a little concerned. So for example, I have this ongoing thing about creating different I guess like contrasts between things I've done. So creating different environments to read in, for example, and how does that make it feel? Audiobooks versus reading, and deliberately having some books as audiobooks versus reading them, just for the sake of having both. Deliberately not playing every mobile game I play on my phone or on my computer emulator, just for the sake of having both of them. You know, I play the one I like better on my phone. I play the one I like better on my computer. But I seek out having a mix of those things, specifically so that there's more contrast between them. This isn't enough on its own, I'm just explaining the basic premise. Things like taking a shower completely in the dark with a candle lit, and then taking a shower with the lights bright on, occasionally staying up wicked late, occasionally going to bed bluntly early. Probably shouldn't do those things, but it does create some contrast to be up at very different times, going for walks at different times of day, wearing clothes that are a little too cold or a little too warm, or things like this. Sometimes just being in this ghastly state of being for no particular reason that doesn't really hurt me, but I wouldn't choose, except I did choose it because I just want something weird. Sometimes it's nice to just, I don't know, have a period of time where things are different. My partner and I have even talked about specifically setting aside a week or so every year where we deliberately avoid each other, like go, you know, separate, I guess, just for the sake of experiencing the contrast, because we usually feel happier when we do that. Just like how not unrestrainedly talking to each other every single time we see each other out in our common area makes our relationship better. Some amount of contrast will make it better. Is it a week? I don't know. I don't know what amount it is. Even parlay itself is largely just when I see a parlay that looks kind of overwhelming or tiring, yeah, it's kind of good. As long as I can just do it and I don't feel insecure that it's like not going to be okay in my life if I do it wrong or something. Who cares? Like, what's the problem? You know what I mean? My life is better if I have that, not worse. That's an amount of discomfort that is good. You know, it's like working out, I guess. So I can't help but feel like there are ways to have I mean, just as a simple example, people often refer to like drugs, like getting high, as giving you an experience that I would argue is similar to the area of experience we've been discussing in this parlay. Do I think it's good to just get high instead of doing this? I'm not recommending that you or anybody else irresponsibly uses drugs, but I think it's worth considering. Like that, people talk about it the same way. Is that kind of the same effect? And so then what are the pros and cons of doing that? It certainly saves you a lot of time. That's one way to think of it. And depending on where you live in the world, a lot of money. I live in a state where cannabis edibles are legal, for example, and they're very cheap and extremely high quality. So I mean, it would be like 50 cents to have an experience that I could definitely consider analogous to some of these you're describing for, 6 hours maybe. That I have had an experience like that for about 50 cents legally in the state I live in, which is pretty crazy. Like that's a time to be alive, right? But the entire reason it's valuable is because it isn't all the time. I would go so far as to say, to take my idea to an extreme, well, right, that means it's good to do both. Pick a leaner game that gives you the cruel game experience and then play that, and also, do the high thing. Again, I don't want to recommend that people abuse drugs because I think most people do. They don't use them the way I'm describing. But I think it's relevant to the parlay, and we're an hour and 50 minutes in, so too bad. We have to be able to talk about whatever comes up here. So on the one sense, to finish that first line of reasoning, yeah, there's a lot of reasons to, Mr. Foot, your radar for things not being worth it is working correctly. There is a prickle of, you don't need to do this to get that feeling. So why am I doing this? For sure. And I get what you mean when you say that. And also, I mean, again, while I was saying before, we know that game design can probably advance to the point where you can get this feeling without the cruelty. Well, not now. So if you want the contrast soon, now or soon, then these seem relevant. And it helps us explore something too. You certainly can't rely on game communities broadly to discuss these things because they'll just say it's a get good issue, or they liked the game, so they have to do infinite mental backflips to make a reason why it was good because they like good things. And so it has to be good because they liked it. Therefore, that's proof it's good. This is obviously nonsense, that you could just like things and that's about you. That's not about the thing. The thing might have good qualities that correlate with people liking it more or not. It's very possible that this is something a lot of people would enjoy, but don't have the patience for. And it's also very possible that this is something very few people would enjoy, and almost all of them actually have experienced it. Like it's found most of its audience. It's hard to know. I also think it's possible that some people who would think they wouldn't enjoy these things actually do have the benefit of these things already, and therefore they're correctly sensing it would be redundant. And it's also possible that people think that, but actually really would enjoy playing these experiences and are just nervous because it's a lot of time to invest in something that could easily be a complete waste of time. I'll venture a guess quickly at the examples you gave of cruel designed games that maybe didn't do it for you, Mr. Foot. Noita. Noita has this thing with randomly crafted wands. They're kind of like programs. The wand will have a number of slots and a rate of fire and an amount of like mana or whatever that it can use and a reload speed. They're guns, I guess. But they have a series of slots in them. And these are slots for spells. You put spells in the wand and then it runs them like a program and then reloads. Runs them like a program and then reloads at a speed, a fire rate based on the wand's stats. So the wand itself is kind of a container. It's basically a gun with various stats, and then it's got kind of a programming section of a given length based on the gun that you can put spells into. I'm kind of cutting some corners here. People who play Noida, I know, but you get it. For people who haven't played the game, that's enough for you to understand. So the main thing with Noida is that sometimes the result of firing a wand is not very clear. You look at it, and it's not entirely clear what will happen if you pull the trigger on this weapon. An okay amount of the time, because the wands are randomly generated to an extent, you die is what you happen. What you happens is you die. You pull the trigger, and the entire room explodes in fantastical fashion, and you die immediately. Now it's a roguelike, and it's a quicker paced one to some extent. So you could argue like it's fine. You just can die. It's all right. But while there are any number of reasons that you might have felt the way you did about Noida, Mr. Foot, I definitely understand that one. I think it's because there isn't a sort of tension. To me, that not working, and the games you described working, suggests to me that it is this element of tenseness about the games that is doing the work, where you have a moment to pause and reflect on the thing you're doing and kind of sit with that feeling for a little bit. I will also add that I feel like there's a through line in what you've written here, and you wrote a lot. One of the few benefits of a parlay that is this long is that we get a lot of data about the way you think about these games. And I think one thing that was really useful is there's a through line of the way the game made you feel seen. I hope I'm not ridiculing or making fun of you by saying it this way. For example, you say, the chair is surprisingly comfy. You relax here for a brief minute. That bit. That was a really big moment for you. Why? Like, what is happening in that moment? One of the things is that the game is acknowledging that it is doing the thing it's doing on purpose. But I mean, I would have assumed that. But a lot of people have a tendency to say, as you said, a lot of people write these games off as joke games at the player's expense, but they're obviously not. They're full of philosophy because they intend to evoke this type of response. I don't even think that's bears discussing. They obviously do intend to evoke this response that they got out of you. I'm not interested at all in discussing whether they're trying to do that. Every single piece of data in all of the games points to them intentionally trying to evoke this response. They're doing it on purpose. We're just here to question what they are doing on purpose and how worthwhile that is. I don't think there's any need to discuss whether they actually are trying to do the thing. They obviously are, in my opinion. They're not joke games. That's not the intent by the people that made them. If people feel that way, that's fine. I'm sure that they were aware that would feel that way too. But what this paragraph is doing, let's read it again, actually. The chair is surprisingly comfy. You relax here for a brief minute. This is what it must feel like sitting on a throne. The idea lingers to your mind that you came to these dungeons on your own free will. No one forced you to come here. You could have just slept late on that morning you embarked on this macabre quest of yours. There are countless things you could be enjoying at this very moment, but instead you sit in this chair surrounded by the piercing cold darkness, sitting here knowing that the moment you get up, death might be waiting for you just around the corner. It's horrible, to say the least. There's a lot going on here. One of the many flaws of these longer parlay is that this would be better as its own standalone parlay, where we just talk about that, in my opinion. But that's by the by. One of the benefits of it being included in this big one is that it's in some more context that wouldn't always be included. So let's take advantage of that. This references you could have just slept late on that morning you embarked on this macabre quest of yours. Likely diegetic. In the world of the game, the player probably does that, but also it's non-diegetic. The game is saying, we, the developers, are saying to you, the player, not the character, you could have slept in your real bed instead of playing this video game, of course. That's one thing. The game is demonstrating intent. We talked about that before. If you're feeling like, wow, these games are doing some weird philosophical thing, this paragraph very clearly says, yes, we are. Like, we are doing that. If there was any doubt, which for me there wasn't, but it's fine to like that. But a big thing that this does is to say, are you chewing on these kinds of thoughts when you kind of sit moment to moment with stuff? Huh. Yeah, we get where you're coming from about that. That's pretty messed up. And I think that that has some value, but also I think reading this whole parlay is clearly something you want, like that type of thing. I would even go so far as to say the very fact that you like parlay as much as you do, having written a dissertation length document of parlay that I always read the prompts out of when I read yours instead of out of the Discord channel, that you like parlay a lot because this is something that there you have a relative lack of in your life. Now, obviously, that's part of why I designed the service. I think for a lot of people, getting to chew on these kinds of thoughts, while very valuable, desirable to have in your everyday life, is something it's time consuming for a lot of people. I personally, me, Zandy, have too much of this in my life, actually. But I thought it would be nice to channel that and give some of it to other people, needing to cost a modest amount of money because it will end up taking a lot of time. But I have, if anything, too much of this kind of thing, and I think that's beneficial, and so that's why I've offered it. We can infer just by the fact that you enjoy parlay that this is a thing that is a need in your life, and these games meet it. Them discussing that meets that. Darkest Dungeon and Noida don't discuss that as much. Noida is a little colder, I'd describe it as, or nondescript, and Darkest Dungeon is a little more diegetic. It's not as interested in saying, hey, you the player, why are you doing this? It's more like, just in the game, look at these characters doing this thing. Both perfectly fine things, but just not, like, if those failed for you, but the other games you gave as an example succeeded for you, I do think that is a through line between those things, is that it just makes more room for, like, seeing that aspect of a thing that you're thinking about a lot, that I can relate to that, think about a lot too. And as someone who does have that need met, I can absolutely imagine if I didn't, I would want a game that talked about that more. Recently, I read a book. It's called The Starless Sea. I recommend it if you, maybe not to Mr. Foot, I don't know, but if you have trouble getting into books, this book does something really interesting. The author has written in characters that speculate about the plot of the book you're reading during the book. Because in a little tiny spoiler, but it comes up very early, you are reading the same book as the characters in the book are reading to an extent. And so they speculate on the nature of the book. How does this not give it away? It's very simple. They're just wrong most of the time, or they don't behave with the rest of the book. They're reading the same book, but they don't think the same thing you're going to about it. Of course they don't. They have a different perspective, on account of being trapped inside of it. And it's a lot of fun. And it's an interesting way to teach or tutorialize. This is a very game design heavy writer as well. It's Erin Morgenstern. If you've read The Night Circus, it's interesting. She didn't do much of that in that first book, but then this one, it's a very different side of her as a writer that was unexpected. Very cool. I think The Night Circus is fine. This is doing something pretty interesting. So it could be cool if you want to read it. It's called The Starless Sea. I noted that one of the things I was liking about the book is that I just hadn't seen writers play that much recently. / I do think there's kind of a issue in fiction at the moment where writers are very by the book, boo, which it's just kind of a shame. Like, I liked Gideon the Ninth and Herod the Ninth by Tamsin Moore, I think you pronounce her name, a lot, because that author is just kick-flipping in the text. Like, it's not entirely necessary all of the time, but I think the books are, like, funny and well constructed and enjoyable. But more to the point, it's like they're doing something kind of weird that I just found refreshing. I'm not sure I would argue it's actually that good. There's a good narrative reason for it, but not an amazing narrative reason. And it comes at the cost of being hard for people to access. Herod the Ninth is written primarily in the second person, which I think a lot of people find weird to read. And there's a narrative, very, very good, perhaps the best I've ever read so far, a narrative reason why it's in the second person. But I think for a lot of people, it's just out as a recommendation because they're not going to enjoy that way of reading it. Is that worth that cost? It's a very similar situation, I think. The difference with The Starless Sea is just that I don't think there's a real drawback. It's just the characters do speculate on what's going on. And sometimes people are very quick-witted about it. Just like a lot of the time the characters will speculate on what's happening and they're completely wrong. Occasionally, a character will give away a giant plot detail hilariously quickly because that's what they would do in the situation, and the book wants you to know it's a two-way street. The book is not never right. That's not how it works. Again, it's kind of to tutorialize that sort of reading into the thing. One of my favorite lines from the book is, "Symbols are for interpretation, not definition." Say it louder, Aaron Morgenstern. Some people haven't quite heard yet. No, I'm sure you have by that point in the book. The whole book is like, you don't really need to say that anymore. Like, hopefully the person has gotten it. Death of the author. The author is well and truly not here. They have left the building. And it's just us hanging out, reading the book together, you and the characters. And I liked that because I'm kind of sick of it not being the case. That isn't to say that nobody else would like the book. I think it would be very useful to the right person, but just to say that it fills a role. The thing about it is not that that is good or bad writing, but I don't know, but that it is certainly effective at that thing. And more than anything, the thing that I liked about that in that book, that I see you liking in these games, is that the book begs the question, is it good to do this? Nobody ever just has the characters speculate about the plot details in the book. But why not? Is that a bad thing to do? Let's just do it and find out. Now, that's not the approach I would take personally, but I found that very refreshing. Like, great, you know? And I hear that a lot in a lot of the text of this parlay, that almost more than anything, it seems to me, you like that these games beg the question, should games be like this or not? I don't know, the games say, which is perhaps inadvisable, but then they respond to that by saying, let's just give it a try. And the results are, yeah, okay, I don't know. Like, they just did it. And so I don't think that's bad. I mean, I think that the valuable thing about these games is that they ask that question, they further that question. And thus, the least valuable thing about them is you could just already ask that question, you could argue. But it's not wrong to explore them the way you want to. I just think it's the case that, troublingly, the kind of person who wants to explore this subject probably won't reliably find the same things interesting. If you are a person who is interested in exploring, like, why do games always do it that way? What if you don't have to? Why don't you just not? Why do characters in books not just also speculate on the details of the plot? Can you like not, you can do that. I can write that. So why don't people let's just do it. Will my publisher just say no? What if I just make them say yes somehow because I had a previously successful book? I'm not saying that's what she did, but and then, you know, it's been well regarded, I guess. I don't know. That doesn't mean anything. The troubling thing is, I think that people take their own paths through thinking about that. So it's entirely possible that somebody who's interested in that subject will not like any of these games, even though they're exactly what did that for you, because it was the way of furthering your project on the subject that did that well. On the other hand, Nier Automata maybe sets itself apart in that previous parlay, where no, it's using much more objective structure to cause an effect that were people willing to sign along for the ride, it pretty reliably will have this effect. Not the exact same way, but my partner like relatively bounced off Nier Automata as a whole. She felt like, this is really good, but I don't really see what all the fuss was about with you and that one patron of yours, she said to me. But it still had a big impact on me, just as she told me about it, not to spoil for you, so I won't tell you. It wasn't the same place that it had an emotional impact on me. Like, it kind of still worked, and it worked for the same reasons, but just not quite in the same way, sure. But I would argue that that's the big loss here, is that these are not truly achieving that goal in and of themselves. It's more you, I think, than it is the game. Although the developers clearly made these because they felt like it fit a need. Cruelty Squad, for example, was absolutely made because the developers feel like it's a response to current first-person shooter design, of course. Very clearly, just looking at any of the game and knowing when it comes out. Like, it's not, while it might not be permanently effective in that way, it was clearly made with that impermanent effect in mind. So, okay, you know, that's fine. And that's just down to artistic intent. Like, I balk at the impermanence of a lot of current media, where people just kind of make things, and the last thing we need is more things, but then they even make them in a way that won't even be valuable in the future. But isn't that itself kind of a response to the time that we live in? Fine. Like, that's not what I choose to do, but like, I don't think that's silly that people do that. It's kind of profound, actually. I don't know. Of them, not me, apparently, because I said that was stupid and then realized it's kind of not stupid. So, yeah, I think that's why. I think it's because more than, good game design is the basics that so many games could so easily get right and gain so much, but then just don't for like no real reason. But as 99% of the time good as that is, it remains a basic that is there to be broken when needed. It just doesn't often need to be broken. So I don't think it's hypocritical to say that these games were fun to you, even though they violate some of those design principles. And I also suggested a good amount of the time in this parlay that they maybe don't exactly violate all those design principles, or you could do what this game did well without violating that design principle. This game maybe just didn't do it. Like in Underrail, I was saying, a game that wants you to respond to every eventuality, to have, kind of at the base level, finally good design, I think would need to clearly communicate those things. And Underrail might not do that, but it could do that. Like, it's not like it would be broken if it did do that. I don't think. And so I'm not really holding it against the design concept as a whole, that we humans are imperfect mere mortals. You see what I mean? It's okay if they just haven't yet perfected that design, but it could be, and they just unfortunately are not there yet. So, yeah, I don't know. This is why I'm more critical of, like, Cyberpunk gives you the fantasy of, role playing as a sexy cyborg uh, mercenary, but doesn't let you respec infinite times. Like, that is kind of a flaw in a way that the build system being incomplete isn't, to me, where it just doesn't fit the design at all. Like, that just doesn't make sense in any way you would play the game, except the way you play other older role-playing games, which I get why that's done in those games, but there's so many ways it doesn't fit in this game. And so I kind of feel like that is a transient game design thing, that they just followed because it's there. And if you really looked at this game in a vacuum, that it just isn't a good fit for that game. But they did it because it was there. And that's okay. Whereas the build system, it's like, well, they tried a bunch of new things. A lot of them were very good. But I mean, if they had kept going on that train of thought, because they had a train of thought, they would evidently have arrived at a better system. I kind of feel like in some ways the system was better before. And there's also a lot of new good and bad things about the changes they made. But this isn't about Cyberpunk. So that's the answer I have for you. Now let's go through the questions you actually asked. Are you gaslighting yourself? I think that would be a strong way to say it here. No. But does this mean that these games are like good for being this way? I think that's up for debate. Again, a lot of it falls down to, what do you think the value of making kind of responsive or reactive pieces of work is? Why do I feel like they can break rules of design that you despise in any other game? Well, they have a reason to, and reason is the god for game design, in my opinion. If they have something that they're trying to achieve by breaking that game design idea, and it is reasonable to assume that they actually need to do that. We don't know, but it's reasonable to assume that they need to. Does fear and hunger need to instantly kill you to create its effects? We don't know that it does, but it's reasonable to assume that it might, so that they chose to do that is like coherent. We just don't know, unfortunately, but it's not their fault for not being ascended beings that have made every possible game design, so I don't think that's that much of a conflict. Have they turned me into an elitist? You writing this whole section about this, no. I think you're fine. People will think anything well thought through is highfalutin, but that's anti-intellectual. And I think the fact that you're questioning even a benefit you liked, that you put a lot of mental effort into, is enough of a check that you are willing to interrogate that. No, I wouldn't worry. Are crew games the new path for venturing outside the invisible wall that we're looking for? Or have we lost the plot somewhere along the way and we're closing in on the black wall, the place where maybe this art shouldn't have been created? I don't think it's really either. This is just one of the branches that grows out of the soil in the way of progress. A seed sprouts, and as we move in a new direction, we take a bunch of little paths, some of which branch off seemingly further at first, but then die back down, while others, slow but steady winning the race, manage to grow even further over time. And do I personally think that this way of doing game design is going to endure and flourish and be this big thing? No. I think that kind of similar to the FromSoft boom, we're going to see this form of, like, I would argue slightly fetishized difficulty being a kind of big sprout that will ultimately be a pretty minor thing in game design's history. But that's just my guess. And I think that the reason is that a lot of it relies on design that is not entirely at its rest state. A lot of the appeal relies on things very loudly being the way they are, and the world moves so fast nowadays that, I mean, it's temporary stuff, but it sure feels permanent. But we won't always feel like this, and thus these games will not always have this appeal. Thus, I think a lot of their benefits are transient, while their detriments, the design trade-offs they made, are permanent. They're things that are inherently bad in a way that isn't based on the time we live in. They take a lot of time. They're very punishing in a way that just uses up time. These are more objectively, more permanently negative things for things that are only temporarily subjectively positive. But it's hard to say. I mean, again, for a lot of these, it's like, I feel like some of this design sounds like it's so close to maybe having its cake and eating it too. So I'll let you know about Underrail, I guess suffice it to say. Hope you enjoyed this two-parter, folks. This was a lot longer than even the Nier Automata parlay, I think, was shorter than this. It might have been the same length. Because I thought there was a lot to get into with this one, and you had something you wanted to hash out. The real reason I felt free to make this one just longer is that I'm not convinced this one needed to be a double. I feel like breaking this up more could have worked. And I just wanted to take advantage of the fact that we are not doing that. I consented to doing it as a two-parter, or became almost a three-parter, but what are you going to do? And I wanted to take full advantage of that. So there's no harm, no foul. We talked about it beforehand, but I just don't expect, like, a lot of these going forward. If you commission Parley, please do try to make it, something that could fit into, the 40-ish minute chunk that we normally do. And if you try really hard and do a ton of Parley, and some of them you just can't fit, I mean, we can obviously try to work it out. But I think to me, this is a data point in favor of, I feel like I could have broken this down into two satisfying parlay, potentially. Anyway, it was still very interesting, and again, it had its benefits having everything all together. Sometimes this is good now and again, I'm kind of between what I just said and, or should I encourage people that do parlay every month for years to just do a long one once a year? Because it's kind of interesting. I don't know, like, that's kind of fun. So don't feel bad. I'm just not going to encourage them either. That's all I'm trying to say. I think they have some value when it's every once in a while. Looking forward to the next one. Folks, if you want to get your own parlay in most ways like this one, you can do that using a link in the description. Looking forward to having you. I'm sure there's plenty of topics that are both longer and shorter than this that people would love to talk about, and I'd love to have them. That's why I do this. And again, I think this is an interesting one for showing the kind of goal of Parley, which is you can get some processing power divested into someone else who's happy to think about your thing that you're stuck on. Great. One of the most interesting uses of Parley. So if that's something you would like, there's something you'd like to chew on. I've noticed a little more of that parlay recently. Vampire has one queued in that's kind of like this as well. That's cool. Do one like this. Don't feel self-centered. Well, you're welcome. You're in good company. It's great to spend some time chewing on those thoughts yourself. This is a place where you can do that. Looking forward to it.